Listen, I did spontaneously decide to move around some furniture right before filming this, so we're just trying something new, and if I hate it, it's going right back. Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my October wrap-up. I think it's safe to say that October 2023 will be a month that is seared into our memories for generations to come. And it does feel strange sitting here doing my usual thing, but I think the best thing I can do with my platform right now is to actually use it. And you'll also see those conversations about the necessity of Palestine liberation folded into what I read this month as well. As always, I've included helpful links below to help activate you and empower you to learn more about why the fight for Palestinian liberation is not only urgent, but is also a fight for all of us. With that said, let's just get into it, starting with By Any Other Name by Aaron Cotter. I read this as an ARC, but it came out on October 10th, and I was sent a review copy courtesy of Simon Teen and Colored Pages Book Tours. This is a YA historical queer mystery adventure story set in Elizabethan London. We're following a character who goes by the false name of Will Hughes in order to protect his identity and hide the fact that his family are well-known traitors to the crown. When his mentor, the infamous playwright Christopher Marlowe, is murdered under mysterious circumstances, Will learns that Marlowe was actually a spy for the Queen, and his mission was to uncover an ancient order of assassins. In a surprising twist, Will finds himself picking up the threads left behind by his mentor and somehow finds himself as the next spy master to the Queen, even though he feels no loyalty to the monarchy or to the project of expanding her imperial regime. To make things worse, he's forced to partner up with the young Lord James Bloomsbury, whose intellect, entitlement, and haughtiness are rivaled only by his charm and annoyingly good looks. Content warnings for blood, graphic injury, graphic violence, and death, instance of suicide, some explorations of colonization and imperialism, and some references to child abuse. This was one of the best times I've had reading a book in all of 2023. This story is so incredibly fun and somehow hits all of my favorite niches. It has subterfuge, it has high treason, it's a critique and takedown of the upper class, it has theater gaze and science gaze. What else could I want? In my Instagram post, I wrote that this book is as far away from all vibes, no plot that you can possibly get. It is all vibes, all plot, 100% of the time, by which I mean the story is vigorously plotted and delightfully fast-paced. There is not one dull moment. Reading this for me was like a full body experience. I was swooning, I was laughing, I was tensed up. My mouth was fully agape with all the dramatic twists and turns. It was really fun to read in that sense because, again, both main characters have a connection to the stage in some way. So they really understand the theater of deceit, shall we say, but also the role that acting and acting out plays in the project of fighting for justice. In terms of tone and feel, imagine what it would be like if Cat Sebastian wrote for a YA audience, because that's exactly what this feels like. The story has that same intricate interplay of humor, banter, high-stakes capers, tender queer romance, and complex political intrigue that just makes for an incredibly rich story that's so much fun to read. I can't say it enough. Not only is this story plot-forward and action-packed from front to back, but the emotional complexity of the characters also adds to what makes it so unforgettable. The biggest thing these characters are grappling with by far is the concept of trust. Especially for Will, who's an actor and someone trying to bury his past and hide the fact that his parents were traitors, which could easily get him arrested or even killed. The line between fact and fiction is all but entirely blurred in his own head. For his own safety, his entire life has been an act. He no longer recognizes when he needs to put up that front as a shield and when he can take it down and just be himself. It's hard for him to embody that kind of vulnerability that's necessary to trust someone else, or even to trust himself in some cases. The story really explores that catch-22, how trust is something that can never truly be earned unless it's also given at the same time. And the question is whether these characters can work together and put their lives in each other's hands if they don't exercise complete and total trust. At the end of the day, trust is an offering. It's an ongoing conversation. It can be given as easily as it can be taken away. And it's fascinating to see how what the characters choose to offer and what they choose to withhold affects the entire course of the story. I just had a great time reading this. I love how much the story is able to accomplish in terms of both plot and character development. The world of the story is so expansive, and I think the author could absolutely write more companion books with some of the side characters if they wanted to. A couple of things towards the end wrapped up a little too quickly for me, especially given the story's length and pacing, but that's just a very minor note. This was truly something special, and I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, my library hold came through for the audiobook of Never Whistle at Night, an Indigenous dark fiction anthology edited by Shane Hawk and Theodore C. Van Elst Jr., and the audiobook is read by a full cast. As it says right on the tin, this is an anthology of dark fiction written by Indigenous authors. It ranges everywhere from contemporary fiction to horror to supernatural and paranormal stories. But regardless of genre, every story in this anthology is exploring darkness. It features authors like Sherry DeMoulin, Rebecca Roanhorse, Richard Van Camp, David Heska Wambly-Wyden, Wabagashig Rice, Tommy Orange, Darcy Littlebadger, Brandon Hobson, Morgan Talty, Carson Faust, just to name a few, and there's also an introduction by Stephen Graham Jones. Just for clarity, these content warnings I'm about to share are for the entire anthology. It's gonna be a lengthy list, it's gonna sound like a lot, but I've tried to be as thorough as possible. Content warnings for death and grief, blood, injury and graphic violence, colorism and anti-Indigenous racism, pregnancy loss, sexual content, some descriptions of domestic abuse, and child neglect, vomit, animal death, some body horror, references to abductions, murder, suicide and genocide, ableism and ableist violence, instances of gun violence, and some depictions of grooming and sexual abuse. I'm gonna keep this fairly brief, not because there's any shortage of things to say about this incredible collection, but just because reviewing anthologies presents a challenge because there's no singular reflection or takeaway I can give that would apply to every single piece. And that's a good thing, that's the way it should be. But what I can say is that this is one of the best anthologies I've ever read, full stop. The consistency of quality across the board is something that not every anthology can accomplish. I was talking about this book with some friends and I said, do you know how stacked your Indigenous dark fiction and horror anthology has to be for Stephen Graham Jones to not even need to contribute? Which is not a value judgment against him or this lineup of authors in any sense. In fact, I respect him so much for stepping aside to make room for new and lesser known Indigenous voices, and I actually added a few full-length novels to my TBR from new to me authors just based on their stories. I think what I appreciate most about this anthology is the incredible range between the stories. Whether they're contemporary or have some kind of genre element, all of them are grappling with the internalization of real-life horrors and traumas in some way, and I love that all of them find their own path towards that central theme, if that makes sense. I've said it before, but I think the best kind of horror is the kind that coaxes our imagination towards or even past the furthest limitations of reality. It's about overcoming the impossible. It's about articulating when something is deeply wrong and being strong enough to name that violence for what it is when we encounter it face to face. I think all of these stories do that in brilliant fashion and also allow Indigenous characters themselves to be monstrous, to explore how the traumas and atrocities passed down through generations can manifest themselves when left unchecked. It's really great stuff. My favorites were White Hill by Rebecca Roanhorse, The Ones Who Killed Us by Brandon Hobson, Snakes Are Born in the Dark by D.H. Trujillo, Scariest Story Ever by Richard Van Camp, The Prepper by Morgan Talty, Eulogy for a Brother Resurrected by Carson Faust, and Copgrass by Tommy Orange. I gave this 4.5 stars. Then I finally got a chance to read The Luis Ortega Survival Club by Sonora Reyes. This is a queer Latina contemporary story that's basically pitched as John Tucker Must Die, but make it an emotionally comprehensive exploration of rape culture that's extremely queer, extremely neurodivergent, and extremely BIPOC. Our main character, Ariana Ruiz, is a queer Mexican autistic girl who's largely nonverbal and very rarely talks outside of her home. She mostly keeps to herself, which is why it's such a big deal when Luis Ortega, one of the most popular guys in school, starts paying attention to her and trying to be friends. They end up going to a party together and having sex, which is something that Ari did not consent to at any point. And before she can even process how she feels about that, the whole school is immediately buzzing with rumors about the fact that she's quote-unquote promiscuous. But then Ari finds a note in her locker that eventually leads her to a group of students who not only offer her solace, but who are secretly planning to expose Luis face for the predator he truly is. Content warnings for mentions of vomit, instances of bullying and sexual harassment, both physical and verbal, explorations of rape, which is off-page, and rape culture, references to infidelity, some ableist language, and some descriptions of PTSD. I'm so glad I finally made time to read this. Sonora's debut, The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School, was one of my favorite books of 2023, and their sophomore release does not disappoint. This is definitely a hard-hitting story in the sense that it's openly naming and exploring rape culture and post-rape trauma, but it also manages to be lighthearted and hopeful as it offers a pathway forwards for all survivors. Again, this is definitely not a story that pulls any punches. It definitely takes you through the trenches as Adi and her new friends work their way through feelings of fear, shame, self-hatred, self-doubt, anger, and really grapples with the societal power imbalance between the abuser and the victims of abuse. And what I really appreciate about the story, besides the fact that it's a highly emotional, complex, empowering, community-driven story, is that it offers the reader the information they need in order to identify patterns of abuse in the first place. It's done very organically, it's woven effortlessly into the fabric of the narrative, and I just have so much respect for books like this that don't just stop at being a compelling, well-executed fictional story, but that can also effectively function as a toolbox and have takeaways that could very easily either save or change someone's life. But to focus back in on the story itself, I just found it to be tremendously powerful. It's very much about a reclamation of autonomy and identity, especially when experiences such as rape are meant to demean and diminish the victims, are used as a way to violently seize control, and effectively creates a social dynamic where the victims are rendered invisible and powerless. That is an especially salient point for a character like Adi, who's largely non-social and non-verbal. It's hard for her to share things with other people on even the best of days, but when that's compounded by trauma and this social stigma of shame and silence, that makes things even worse. But in a subversion of that forced silence, the core of this story truly is friendship and the formation of community, and the heart of the story is firmly rooted in showing how healing those experiences can be. Alone, these characters are more likely to fade into the background, but together they have so much more power with their collective voice. The story shows that there is power in naming injustice, in being purposeful in the ways that we dismantle systemic violence, in fighting against the urge to erase ourselves when our erasure is often the end goal with those who would benefit from our complicity in our silence. I just really appreciate the delicate balance this story is somehow able to achieve. It gives the proper emotional weight to the trauma these characters have experienced and are working through, but it also has that edge of being a strangely fun revenge story full of shenanigans and hijinks, and there's even some really sweet romantic subplots. This was another fantastic story from this author. I can't wait to see what they do next. I will say that the way some things wrap up towards the end is borderline after-school special in the way it feels, but that's just a very minor note, if anything, and I still gave this 4.5 stars. Okay, so it was at this point in the month that we started getting news here in the States about the genocidal and occupational violence being experienced by Palestinians. So from this point on, you'll see some titles mixed in that are indicative of how I've been challenging the limitations of my own knowledge, how I've been trying to combat my ignorance, and also center Palestinian voices. I think Kayla from Books and Lala said it best when she said, how can we be out here reading hundreds of books a year and claim that we don't have the time, capacity, or ability to read something, to educate ourselves on this crisis? And also, I think it's important to note that the ways we educate ourselves can't always be neatly quantified or cataloged on a website like Goodreads or Storygraph. There are a lot more things I've been consuming, be it articles, research, media, documentaries, first-hand accounts, that are not things you're gonna find in a wrap-up video. So as readers, I encourage your activism to be comprehensive, to expand even beyond books, but also books are an incredible resource. With that said, it was at this point that I picked up Rifka by Mohammed El-Kurd. This was recommended to me months and months ago by a dear Palestinian friend, and I regret that it took this crisis for me to pick it up. That should not have happened, and I need to be better about that. This is a poetry collection named after the author's late grandmother who was forced to flee from her home upon the genocidal establishment of the settler colony Israel, and also explores the author's own experience of dispossession living in occupied Sheikh Jarrah. Even before any nonfiction, historical-based text, or informative reading, I would recommend these poems. It is an incredibly powerful collection that cuts to the heart of the issue without sentimentality, without cushioning the blow, without centering the need for Western understanding or comfort. These poems are born of a deep-seated anger and pain and grief and frustration, and the author just allows those emotions to be at the forefront without any appeals or qualifiers needed. In this collection, the poet definitively rejects the premise that he owes the Western world the courtesy of performing alchemy from his suffering, which is to say he doesn't feel the need to transform his pain into something beautiful, something digestible, something acceptable that will make uninformed readers feel good about themselves. These poems are a tremendous example of what happens when art meets irrevocable truth. These words don't allow us to look away from the parts of the world that make us uncomfortable. They urge the reader to resist the narrative of helplessness, to resist the urge to sanitize, to resist the infantilization of Palestinians, as if Palestinian adults were not once Palestinian children, and also deserving of dignity and life, full stop, without needing to audition for that right. In his poems, El-Kurd makes a homeland out of truth. This collection is such an offering, and I use that word very intentionally because Palestinians owe us nothing. They don't have to prove their humanity or their worth. They don't have to distill their experiences into bite-sized pieces that we can relate to or understand. In his afterword, the author says he no longer feels the responsibility to give humans eyes for humanity, and I think that says everything you need to know about this collection. I highly recommend this. I gave it 5 stars. Like I said, we're going to kind of be springboarding back and forth a bit, so I apologize for the whiplash, but around the same time, I finally got a chance to listen to Monstrillo by Gerardo Samano Cordova. The audiobook is read by Victoria Villarreal and Johnny Ray Diaz. This is an extraordinary piece of queer literary horror. It's written by a queer Mexican author about a queer Mexican family, and the story begins with the death of this family's only son, and in her grief, the mother, Magos, cuts out a piece of her son's lung. Because of the folktale she's heard, she starts nurturing and feeding this piece of lung, and to her surprise, it starts growing into a creature and gradually gaining sentience. This creature seems to resemble her son Santiago, but he's not Santiago because he's vicious and carnivorous and has these innate violent instincts. But they raise him all the same and try their best to assimilate him into society, into their family, but his dark impulses could threaten to destroy his fragile second chance at life. Content warnings for child death and grief, some explicit sexual content, blood, graphic injury, and graphic violence, some recollections of child abuse and religious trauma, some descriptions of dead animals, and some instances of physical abuse. Based on what I had heard about this book beforehand, I went into it knowing it was going to be incredible. And it's always so gratifying when you go into a book like that and you immediately understand what is so special about the story. This is such a powerful and visceral meditation on grief. It's a testament to the formation and resilience of queer found family, even through experiences such as grief, and it's interrogating the lengths we will go to as humans in order to avoid sitting with our own pain. There's something Frankenstein-esque about this story. I think I said something like that in a recent video, but thematically it really does remind me of Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill, which is a retelling of Frankenstein. There's that forbidden creation aspect of the story. It's about creating and nurturing this seemingly horrific entity that, by all laws of nature, should not exist. Much like Mary's humanity is contingent upon the acceptance of the monster she's created in Our Hideous Progeny, Magos' humanity is also at stake in this story. She feels the need to fiercely protect this semblance of her son because if he is seen as indefensible, then by extension, so is she, and so is her life, and so are her choices. And all of that is complicated even further because of her identity as a queer Mexican woman, as someone who extremists and bigots would also claim should not exist, and who could also very easily be construed construed as monstrous herself. I also love the way the story is told. It's broken up into 4 sections, starting with Magos, then her lover Lena, then Santiago's father, Joseph, and finally Monstrillo, also known as M himself. Because of all those different perspectives, we really get an incredibly well-rounded look at the realities and implications of this quote-unquote cursed existence. We see this communal family attempting to raise and love this creature in the only ways they know how, in terribly flawed and human ways, for better and for worse. That is the crux of the story. Magos and Joseph and everyone in their lives are putting on this elaborate facade, trying to live alongside their grief without ever calling it by name, hurting their new child by trying to force him into a box that was never his to begin with. And by doing so, they infinitely compound the pain and grief with their avoidance. At the end of the day, I think this story is really an embodiment of that sentiment that grief demands to be felt. You can dress it up in whatever way you want, you can call it what you want, you can pretend it's something else, you can try to outrun the pain and the loss, but no matter what you do, you cannot change the heart-rending agony of grief. There's so much more I could say, but I know I'm not going to do this book justice. This was easily one of the most incredible reading experiences I've had, not just this year, but any year, and I will anxiously be awaiting this author's next work. This was an easy 5 stars. After that, I listened to Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement by Angela Y. Davis, and the audiobook is read by Angela Davis. This is a collection of interviews, speeches, and essays by Angela Davis, who is a world-renowned activist and scholar who's been at the forefront of numerous liberation movements, sometimes at great personal cost and risk. These essays and discussions reflect on the role of Black feminism, intersectionality, prison abolition, collectivism, civil rights movements and milestones, and their connection to a global network of liberation movements, including anti-apartheid movements. It's a collection that strives to answer the question of how do we keep up forward momentum in a world that's built on such grave and seemingly endless injustice. I talked a bit about this one in my most recent vlog, so I won't spend too much time here, but this book is a great starting point again for anyone who doesn't know the history of Palestine's occupation and why the liberation of Palestinian people is not only incredibly urgent, but incredibly relevant to all of us. Davis touches on a whole range of topics in this very small collection, but the most prominent part of this project is how she illustrates the way that all liberation movements, whether that's fighting for disability access, fighting for queer and trans rights, fighting for indigenous sovereignty, fighting against systemic anti-Blackness, fighting against immigration injustice, ending settler colonialism, and any other anti-oppressive movement, are in fact all the same fight. She explains how if we only care about the forms of oppression that affect us, then we effectively dissolve our own power, because for liberation movements to be effective, they have to be united. She also explores how history has a tendency of distilling liberation movements down to notable individuals, like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, which is actually disempowering long-term because it feeds into this myth that we have to be exceptional in order to make a difference, when actually it's our collective resistance that makes a difference. She's also able to draw some very clear lines between instances like the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson to the genocidal settler colonial violence happening in Palestine at this moment. There are systemic structural, financial, and political ties that the United States has to the IOF, the Israeli Occupational Forces. Our police officers are trained in military tactics by G4S, one of the most profitable private security companies in the world who own and operate the IOF. Our prisons and our immigration detention centers are owned and quote-unquote secured, at least in part, by the parent company who owns G4S. As you see these very obvious connections, it becomes extremely clear how all of these fights are the same fight, and why our advocacy and our care can't just stop with ourselves and our own communities. Like I said, this collection of essays is just a starting point, and an effective one at that. It's a great primer for engaging with these issues critically, and I think you'll be amazed by how much of these writings are as immediately applicable today as they were in 2014, 2015 when Davis first started writing this. I'm not going to give this book a rating because I didn't read it for the purpose of reviewing it, but rather as an educational debrief for myself. But like I said, it's a great jumping off point. It's a very broad overview if you don't know where to start from, and I definitely recommend it. After that, I read and talked about 3 books in my most recent reading vlog. Those books were Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, Mother Country by Etaf from, and the imposition of unnecessary obstacles by Malka Older. I think I did a pretty good job of expressing my feelings on them in that video, and I'm not gonna do it again. So you can either watch that vlog or not. Either way, I respect your choice. On Halloween, I read a queer horror graphic novel called Let Me Out by Emmett Nahill and George Williams. This is an adult graphic novel written by a trans author set against the backdrop of satanic panic sweeping through the New Jersey suburbs circa 1979. When a pastor's wife is found violently murdered in the woods, an FBI agent and a local sheriff team up to take on the case. Unfortunately, they are the very perpetrators of this crime. They've been conducting some highly illegal human experimentation and even human sacrifice. But of course, they want to pin the crime on someone else. So they lean into that satanic panic and find this group of queer and trans friends to accuse as scapegoats. These kids are punks, they're radicals, they're queer, which makes them the perfect suspects. But these friends might just be able to fight back against this grave injustice by making a deal with the devil themselves. Content warnings for blood, gore, graphic violence, and murder, and instances of transphobia, dead naming, and homophobia, including homophobic slurs and transphobic violence. I don't think I have too much to say about this. I read it pretty quickly in just over an hour, and overall it was a very solid Halloween read. I really enjoyed the juxtaposition of perceived satanic panic with actual demonic activity, and how that activity is not initiated by the people you would think. This comic definitely has big ACAB energy, which I appreciate. It definitely explores the deep-seated corruption of federal agencies and police agencies, and reveals how police forces are oftentimes implicit and invested in perpetuating injustice rather than fighting against it. I appreciate the intersectionality of the story as well. A lot of these characters in the main queer and trans friend group are people of color, and the story really highlights how these characters are at a much higher risk of being caught in the crossfires when police hunts, religious extremism, and social and moral panic all overlap at once. I think the most powerful part of the story is definitely what it's building up towards in the end with this element of demonic possession, and I think there's a sort of reclamation of power happening there because these characters are alienated and hunted because of their presumed connection with evil and demonic darkness because of their otherness. So to see them embrace that and welcome that and use that to fight against these injustices is incredibly cathartic in a sense. All of that said, I think the pacing of this comic was a bit off, at least for me. There's so much about the world building, what these agencies are doing with these human experiments, why they want to connect and summon the devil, and even the existence of a demon that we should have been introduced to and more thoroughly introduced to much earlier in the comic. From a technical standpoint, it's also a bit difficult sometimes to follow the narrative through line of the scenes because of how they're laid out, to understand what's happening in the lore of the story, and to feel grounded in the story when sometimes the panels will quickly jump from one thing to the next. So there was definitely more to be desired there, and I do wish the energy of the ending was more evenly dispersed throughout the book, if that makes sense. There's just a lot of unanswered questions, and the story also ends on like a wink to a potential follow-up, but even without hoping for a continuation, I just wish this comic felt a bit more complete on its own. But I would definitely read more from Emmett Nahill. I appreciate what the story is doing, and I gave this 3 stars. The last book I finished, keyword, for the month was my Patreon pick for October, and that was Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. My copy is an ARC, but this came out from Tor Nightfire on July 18th. Patreon is a great way to support the channel and allows me to keep this space ad-free, and also compensates my time for providing captions and making my content as accessible as possible. So if you'd like to support, that's a great way to do it. Camp Damascus is a queer YA horror story set in a small town in Montana where our main character, Rose, lives an extremely religious lifestyle with her God-fearing family and friends. The pride of Neverton, Montana is Camp Damascus, the so-called most effective gay conversion camp in the United States. Rose doesn't think twice about any of this until one day she starts experiencing some very strange and inexplicable things. Content warnings for vomit, instances of body horror, graphic violence, and graphic injury, as well as brief descriptions of mutilation and torture, allusions to suicide, instances of death, portrayals of religious extremism and religious trauma, and experienced homophobia, both external and internal. This was wild from start to finish. I have to say, I didn't know that Chuck had it in him him to write something like this. For those who don't know, he's most well known for his so-called tinglers, which are basically erotic comedy stories that break the fourth wall in some way or use erotic satire to make some kind of commentary. So not only is this Chuck's first traditionally published book, but it's quite a departure from what he usually does. I definitely have to give my hats off in terms of the intensity. The story really goes to some disturbing, grotesque places, and Chuck definitely knows how to execute a hell of a jump scare, if nothing else. So the oppressively sinister atmosphere of the story is incredibly effective and really well executed, and I was also surprised pleasantly by the perspective of the story, because Rose is fully bought into this extremist faith when the story starts. Especially when queer stories deconstruct and confront religious trauma, we're usually reading from the perspective of someone who's been alienated from their faith, from someone who's positioned in opposition to the faith they were raised in, or who's completely abstaining from that faith. But to have a character who's still fully invested in what is actively harming them almost makes the story even more chilling in some ways. We get to see Rose naming and confronting that religious trauma, that pervasive harm, and really contending with what that means for her relationship with her faith as the story progresses. But there's actually nuance. We have someone like Rose who's realizing that she's not in a place where she can engage with or practice her faith in the same way she has been, at least for the moment, which is valid. And we have other characters whose experience with Camp Damascus has strengthened their faith, and they're able to hold both their faith and their queerness at the same time, which is also a valid experience. So I really appreciate that the story is, again, confronting and naming religious trauma, exposing the ways in which religious extremism actively contributes to things like conversion therapy and loss of queer life, but at the same time, the story is not positioning itself as anti-religious. Again, I've always said the most effective horror stories are the ones that see the horrors of real life for exactly what they are and take them to a very literal place, take them to another level by subverting metaphor and abstraction and quantifying them into very real, very tangible forces and experiences. And that's exactly what Camp Damascus does. It's intense, it's surprising, it's disarming, and as simple as it might sound, ultimately I think it's about how love and acceptance is always going to be stronger than fear and hate. I will say that it feels a little disjointed at times. Sometimes we jump from one scene to the next without much connective tissue in between, and there's also times when the messaging is occasionally too on the nose for my taste, so I'm honestly caught between 3.5 stars or 4 stars, but I think I'm leaning towards 4 stars. So those are all the books I finished this month. Again, finished being the key word. I did start Minor Detail by Adanya Shibli, which I mentioned in my reading vlog, but as of filming this, I'm still working my way through it. It's a very short book, but also intense, and rightfully so, and I didn't want to squash it into this wrap-up. I want to give it the space it deserves. But that was my October in a nutshell. I hope you learned something. I hope you added some new things to your TBR. If you have any thoughts on any of these books or want to share what you read in October, feel free to drop all of that down below in the comments. That is everything for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.